Let's get started. Story number 1.
The wind howled against the windows, its icy breath seeping through the cracks and making the old house groan as if alive. I stood in the kitchen, holding a mug of steaming hot chocolate, staring out at the snowstorm. The streets were buried under a thick blanket of snow, and not a single car or person had passed by in hours. It was the kind of night that made you feel utterly alone. And I was alone. My parents were on an overnight trip to visit my grandmother in the hospital, leaving me to watch the house. I'd reassured them I could handle it. After all, I was 17. It wasn't my first time staying home alone, but something about this winter night felt different. The silence in the house was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. I turned away from the window, trying to shake off the creeping unease. The house was old, sure, but it wasn't haunted. My logical brain told me that every noise was just the house settling or the wind battering the walls. Still, I couldn't ignore the goosebumps crawling up my arms. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 9, its deep chime reverberating through the house. I decided to distract myself with a movie, so I grabbed a blanket and settled on the couch in the living room. The warm glow of the TV screen was comforting, and for a while, I managed to lose myself in the cheesy horror film I'd chosen. Then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It was faint at first, almost drowned out by the wind. I paused the movie, straining to hear. The sound came again, 3 deliberate taps, like knuckles on glass. My heart skipped a beat as I turned to look at the large bay window behind me. The snow was falling heavily and the glass was frosted, but I could make out nothing unusual. I told myself it was just the storm playing tricks on me. Maybe a branch was scraping against the window. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I got up, drawing the curtains closed, and returned to the couch. The tapping stopped. Relieved, I pressed play on the remote and tried to focus on the movie. But the uneasy feeling lingered, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I kept glancing at the curtains, half expecting to see them flutter or a shadow move behind them. It wasn't long before the sound returned. This time, it was louder and more insistent. Tap! 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 But it wasn't coming from the window anymore. It was coming from the back door. I froze, the remote slipping from my hand. The back door led to a small porch and then to the snow-covered yard. There was no reason for anyone to be out there in this weather. Slowly, I stood and made my way to the kitchen. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate. I reached the door and hesitated, my hand hovering over the lock. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. I peeked through the frosted glass pane, but the porch light was out and all I could see was darkness. The tapping stopped as suddenly as it had started. My heart was racing now, and I double-checked the lock before backing away. I tried to convince myself it was the wind again. Maybe the snowstorm had knocked something loose. But deep down, I didn't believe it. I decided to turn on every light in the house, hoping the brightness would chase away the unease. As I moved through the house, flipping switches, I noticed something odd. The air felt colder in certain spots, almost as if a window had been left open. But I checked every window. They were all shut and locked. By the time I reached the upstairs hallway, the chill was unbearable. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I had the distinct feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper, so soft it could have been mistaken for the wind. But it wasn't the wind. It was a voice. "Come here." My blood turned to ice. The whisper seemed to come from the end of the hallway, where the door to my bedroom stood ajar. The light inside flickered, even though I was certain I hadn't turned it on. I stared at the door, paralyzed with fear, as the whisper came again. "Come closer." My instincts screamed at me to run, to get out of the house, but my legs felt like lead. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I forced myself to move. I reached the door and pushed it open slowly. The room was empty. The flickering light was my desk lamp, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I stepped inside, my eyes darting around, searching for anything out of place. That's when I saw it. A single wet footprint on the floorboards leading to my closet. My breath caught in my throat. The footprint was too large to be mine, and too fresh to have come from hours ago. I took a shaky step back, my eyes locked on the closet door. It was closed, but the gap at the bottom was dark. too dark as if it was swallowing the light. I reached for my phone, my fingers fumbling as I dialed my mom's number. The line rang and rang, but no one answered. Desperation clawed at me. I needed to get out, but the only way to the stairs was past the closet. As I edged toward the door, the closet creaked. I froze, watching as the door slowly began to open. My scream caught in my throat as a figure emerged, a tall, shadowy silhouette with no discernible features. It didn't move like a person. It glided, silent and menacing. I bolted. Down the stairs, through the living room, and toward the front door. I fumbled with the lock, throwing it open and stumbling out into the snow. The freezing air burned my lungs, but I didn't stop running until I reached the street. When I turned back, the house was dark and silent. But in the upper window, my bedroom window, I saw it. The figure was standing there, watching me, its shadowy form outlined against the flickering light. I didn't go back inside that night. Instead, I ran to my neighbor's house, banging on the door until they let me in. I told them everything, though I'm not sure they believed me. When my parents came home the next day, I refused to stay in the house alone again. The figure never appeared again, but I can't shake the feeling that it's still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for another winter night. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The snowstorm started earlier than expected, blanketing the world outside in an eerie silence. I sat curled up on the couch with a blanket draped over me, the flickering glow of the fireplace casting dancing shadows on the walls. It was a cozy winter night, at least that's how I tried to frame it. But the truth was, I was alone in the house, and there was a nervous energy in the air that I couldn't shake. My parents had gone out for a weekend getaway, leaving me in charge of our old family home. It was nothing I hadn't done before, but the winter night added a certain weight to the solitude. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows. Occasionally the old house would creak, its bones shifting as if responding to the storm. I tried to distract myself with a book, but my attention kept drifting. I was hyper-aware of every sound, every groan of the wood, every faint hiss of the wind against the roof. The clock ticked loudly in the corner, each second dragging slower than the last. When the wind picked up, it almost sounded like a voice, a faint whisper just out of reach. I brushed it off as my imagination and got up to make some tea. The kitchen was colder than the rest of the house, the kind of chill that seemed to seep into your bones. I wrapped my arms around myself as I waited for the kettle to boil, staring out the window at the swirling snow. The yard was completely obscured by the storm, and the world beyond felt impossibly far away. As I poured the tea, I thought I heard something, a faint tapping. I paused, the sound of the kettle fading behind me. It came again. Tap, tap, tap. My pulse quickened as I turned toward the back door. The sound was soft but deliberate, as though someone was knocking with just the tips of their fingers. I stared at the door, my mind racing. It couldn't be someone outside. Not in this storm. Maybe a branch had come loose and was hitting the glass. Gripping the counter for support, I took a hesitant step forward, then another. My breath fogged the glass as I peered through the small frosted window. Nothing. I sighed, my shoulders relaxing slightly. It was just the wind, or the house, or anything other than what my imagination was conjuring. But as I turned to leave the kitchen, the tapping came again. This time, it was louder. I froze. The sound wasn't coming from the back door anymore. It was coming from the window above the sink, directly behind me. Slowly I turned, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. The window was too high for anyone to reach without a ladder, and yet the tapping persisted. 3 deliberate knocks. I stepped back, the mug slipping from my hand and shattering on the floor. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky and thin. There was no response, just the relentless tapping, and then it stopped. The silence was worse. I waited, my ears straining for any sign of movement, but the house was still. Too still. Gathering what little courage I had, I hurried out of the kitchen and back into the living room, locking the door behind me. My heart was still racing as I sank onto the couch, clutching a pillow to my chest like it might protect me. The fire crackled softly, its warmth doing little to dispel the cold fear that had settled over me. I told myself it was nothing, just the storm playing tricks on me. But the house felt different now. The air was heavier, the shadows darker. I glanced at the clock on the mantel. It was only 10:15. The night stretched ahead of me, long and unforgiving. I decided to distract myself with the TV. The sound and light filled the room, and for a while I managed to push the unease to the back of my mind. But then the power flickered. Once, twice, and then it went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. I grabbed my phone, the dim glow of the screen casting eerie shadows on the walls. My fingers shook as I turned on the flashlight and pointed it around the room. Everything looked the same, but it felt different, as though the house was holding its breath. And then I heard it again. The tapping. But this time it wasn't coming from the windows. It was coming from upstairs. Tap! Tap! I stared at the staircase, the beam of my flashlight trembling in my hand. The sound was deliberate, like someone knocking on the wooden railing. I wanted to run, to grab my coat and bolt out into the storm, but my legs wouldn't move. The sound came again, louder this time. Tap! 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 Who's there? I called, my voice cracking. The question hung in the air, unanswered. Slowly, against every instinct screaming at me to do otherwise, I moved toward the stairs. My feet felt like lead as I climbed, each step creaking under my weight. The tapping stopped as I reached the top, replaced by a heavy silence. I swept the flashlight across the hallway. The doors to the bedrooms were all closed except for mine. It stood slightly ajar, the darkness inside feeling alive. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Is someone there?" I whispered. The door creaked as it swung open a little wider. My flashlight caught the edge of the bed, the dresser, the mirror on the far wall. And then I saw it. A faint outline, standing in the corner. It wasn't solid, but it wasn't nothing either. A shadow darker than the rest, a shape that didn't belong. The air grew colder and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The shadow shifted almost imperceptibly, and then I heard it. Leave. The voice was low and guttural, like the wind howling through a broken window. My paralysis broke, and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. The flashlight slipped from my grasp, clattering to the floor and plunging me into darkness. I didn't look back. I bolted down the stairs, my heart hammering in my chest. The air in the house felt suffocating, as if it were pressing in from all sides. I grabbed my coat and boots, fumbling with the locks on the front door. My fingers were numb and clumsy, but I managed to get it open. The storm hit me like a wall, the wind slicing through my clothes and biting at my skin. I didn't care. I ran out into the snow, my boots sinking with every step, until I reached the street. I turned back, my breath fogging in the icy air. The house loomed in the darkness, its windows black and empty. But in my bedroom window I saw it. A figure, tall and shadowy, standing perfectly still, watching. I didn't stop running until I reached the neighbor's house. They let me in, confused and concerned, as I tried to explain what had happened. But how do you explain something you don't understand yourself? Something no one will believe. The next day, when the storm had passed, my parents returned. I refused to stay in the house alone again. I never told them exactly what happened, but they must have sensed something was wrong. The figure never appeared again, but I know it's still there. Waiting. Watching. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The snowstorm had started earlier than the forecast predicted, and by evening the world outside was buried in white. I sat in the living room, wrapped in a fleece blanket, trying to ignore the creeping silence that came with being home alone. My parents had left that morning to visit my aunt in the hospital and wouldn't be back until the next day. It wasn't the first time I'd been left in charge of the house, but there was something about that winter night that made the empty spaces feel heavier, more alive. The old house groaned against the howling wind, its wooden frame shifting and settling like a living thing. I had turned on nearly every light downstairs, hoping to push away the shadows that seemed to stretch longer than usual. I told myself I was being ridiculous. This was the same house I'd grown up in. Still, my eyes darted to the windows and corners more than once, half expecting to see something move. By 9 p.m., the snow had piled up to the windowsills and the streets were completely deserted. No cars, no people, just the muffled silence of snow pressing against the house. I tried to distract myself with my phone, scrolling through endless posts, but my fingers kept pausing, my ears straining for any sound that didn't belong. That's when I heard it. At first, it was so faint that I thought I'd imagined it. A soft thud, like something tapping against the front door. I froze, my eyes locked on the hallway that led to the entrance. The sound came again, this time louder, more deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. I put my phone down and stood, my heart thudding in my chest. Who would be at the door in the middle of a storm? I hesitated, debating whether I should even check. Maybe it was the wind blowing something against the house, or a branch. Yeah, probably a branch. But the tapping came again, harder this time, as if whoever or whatever was outside was growing impatient. I grabbed my phone and switched on the flashlight, its beam cutting through the dim hallway. Slowly, I approached the door, every step feeling heavier than the last. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. "Who's there?" No answer. I peered through the peephole, but the glass was frosted over, the snow outside obscuring everything. The tapping had stopped, replaced by the low whistle of wind pressing against the house. Swallowing my fear, I flicked on the porch light and cracked the door open just enough to see outside. Nothing. The porch was empty, the snow undisturbed. I closed the door quickly, bolting it for good measure, and tried to laugh off my nerves. It was probably just the storm playing tricks on me. I returned to the living room and turned the TV on, letting the noise fill the space. For a while, I managed to forget the sound, even convincing myself it had never happened. But then the tapping started again. This time, it wasn't at the front door. It was coming from the sliding glass door in the kitchen. My blood ran cold. The backyard was fenced in, and there was no way anyone could get back there without leaving footprints. I stood frozen in the middle of the living room, the sound growing louder, more insistent. Tap! 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 I didn't want to go to the kitchen. Every instinct told me to stay where I was, to call someone, anyone, and ask for help. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to see for myself. I grabbed the flashlight again and edged toward the kitchen, my heart pounding in my ears. The sliding door was covered in condensation, the glass fogged over from the cold, but I could see the faint outline of someone standing on the other side. My breath caught in my throat as I took a step closer, the figure becoming clearer. It was tall and unmoving, its shape distorted by the frosted glass. I reached for the light switch, my fingers trembling. The floodlight in the backyard flickered to life, illuminating the snow-covered yard. There was no one there. The figure was gone. The tapping stopped. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring out into the empty yard. The snow was pristine, untouched. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there at all. My hands were shaking as I turned off the light and backed out of the kitchen, not daring to look behind me. I grabbed my phone and dialed my mom's number, but the call went straight to voicemail. I tried my dad next. Same result. Frustrated and scared, I decided to text my neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, just to see if she was awake. She was in her 60s and lived alone, but she'd always told me to reach out if I needed anything. Me. "Hey, are you awake? Something weird is happening at the house." Her reply came almost instantly. "Mrs. Callahan, are you okay? What's going on?" I hesitated, not wanting to sound crazy. Finally, I typed, "Me, I think someone's outside, but I'm not sure. Can you come check?" She didn't respond right away, and for a moment I thought she'd fallen asleep. Then my phone buzzed. "Honey, I can't come over. The power's out here, and the storm's too bad. Call your parents or the police if you're scared." I stared at the message, the pit in my stomach growing. I didn't want to call the police over what could just be my imagination, but I didn't feel safe either. Before I could decide, a loud crash came from upstairs. I screamed, dropping my phone. The sound echoed through the house like something heavy had fallen or been thrown. My first instinct was to run, to get out of the house, but my keys were in the kitchen, and I'd have to pass the sliding door to grab them. The crash was followed by a slow, dragging sound, like furniture being moved across the floor. It was coming from my bedroom. I didn't want to go upstairs. I didn't want to know what had made that noise. But some part of me, the same stupid part that had gone to the front door in the kitchen, compelled me to move. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a cast iron fireplace poker, and started up the stairs. The hallway was dark, the faint glow from my flashlight barely illuminating the floorboards. My bedroom door was wide open, the darkness inside swallowing the light. The dragging sound stopped as I approached, replaced by an oppressive silence. I stepped into the room, my breath clouding in the freezing air. The window was open, snow blowing in and melting on the hardwood floor. But that wasn't what made my stomach drop. There was writing on the wall, scrawled in something dark and wet. 4 words, scratched into the paint as though by claws. You shouldn't be here. The air felt heavy, suffocating. I backed out of the room, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The moment I crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. I ran, down the stairs, through the living room, and out the front door without stopping to grab my coat or boots. The cold hit me like a wall, but I didn't care. I sprinted through the snow to Mrs. Callahan's house, pounding on her door until she answered. She took one look at me, barefoot, shaking and pale, and pulled me inside without a word. I didn't go back to the house that night. When my parents returned the next morning, they found the bedroom window closed and locked, the walls clean and unmarked. The snow outside was undisturbed, no sign of anyone having been there. But I know what I saw, and I'll never forget those words. You shouldn't be here. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The snowstorm began just after dusk, blanketing the neighborhood in a suffocating quiet. The kind of quiet where every creak, every faint sound feels magnified tenfold. I was home alone, tucked into the large, creaky house where I'd grown up. My parents had left earlier that morning to visit my uncle in the hospital 2 towns over, leaving me in charge. It wasn't unusual for them to leave me alone anymore. I was 18, responsible, and our small town rarely saw trouble. But something about that night felt different. I tried to focus on the movie I'd put on in the living room, but my attention kept drifting to the howling wind outside. Snow battered the windows, creating a sound like fingernails scraping against glass. I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders and glanced at the clock. It was just after 9 p.m. Too early to go to bed, but late enough for the isolation to start creeping in. The first sound came while I was reaching for the bowl of popcorn on the coffee table. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone lightly knocking on a door. I froze, listening, trying to determine if it was just the wind, but it wasn't coming from the front door or the windows. It was coming from the back of the house. The kitchen. I told myself it was nothing, probably just a tree branch swaying in the storm, but the sound didn't stop. Tap, 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 steady, deliberate. Grabbing my phone, I switched on the flashlight and headed toward the kitchen. The hardwood floors were cold under my socks, and the air seemed heavier, colder the closer I got. As I entered the kitchen, the tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by an almost oppressive silence. I scanned the room, my flashlight beam bouncing off stainless steel appliances and gleaming countertops. Everything looked normal. I checked the back door, making sure it was locked, then peered out the small window into the backyard. The floodlight illuminated the snow-covered ground, pristine and untouched. There was nothing there, no branches, no footprints, just the swirling snow. I shook my head, laughing nervously to myself. "You're imagining things," I muttered, turning back toward the living room. But as I reached the doorway, the tapping started again. This time, it came from upstairs. A chill ran down my spine. My parents' room, the guest room, and my bedroom were all up there. No one else was supposed to be in the house. I stood frozen in place, straining to hear over the sound of my own heartbeat. The tapping was soft, deliberate, almost like someone knocking on a wall. I wanted to call someone, my parents, a neighbor, anyone, but my phone was showing no signal. The storm must have knocked out the cell towers. I cursed under my breath and considered my options. Staying downstairs felt safer, but whatever was making that sound wasn't going to go away. I had to know. Grabbing a heavy cast iron skillet from the kitchen, I made my way upstairs. Each step creaked under my weight, the old wood groaning like it was protesting my decision. The tapping grew louder as I climbed, echoing in the narrow hallway. It was coming from my room. My bedroom door was slightly ajar, a thin sliver of light from my bedside lamp spilling into the hall. I always left the light on when I was home alone. Somehow it made the house feel less empty. But now, that warm glow felt sinister, like it was beckoning me into something I didn't want to face. I gripped the skillet tightly and nudged the door open with my foot. My room looked exactly as I'd left it. Bed unmade, clothes piled on the chair, laptop still open on my desk. But the tapping had stopped. I stepped inside, my eyes darting around the room. Nothing looked out of place. I checked the closet, the space under the bed. Nothing. Just as I was starting to convince myself that it was all in my head, the lamp flickered. Once, twice, and then the bulb went out, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking as I turned it on. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on the mirror above my dresser. And that's when I saw it. A shadow. Not my shadow, not a trick of the light, but a figure standing in the corner of the room. It was tall, impossibly thin, and completely still. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at it, unable to move. The shadow didn't have a face, but I could feel it watching me, its presence pressing down on me like a weight. And then it moved. It didn't walk or step forward. It simply shifted, like smoke curling toward the ceiling. The air in the room grew colder, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me. My legs finally obeyed, and I stumbled backward, dropping the skillet with a loud clang. The sound seemed to break whatever spell I was under, and I bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I didn't stop running until I was back downstairs, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. The house was silent again, but I could feel it. Whatever that thing was, it hadn't left. It was still upstairs, waiting. I grabbed my coat and boots, not caring that I was still in my pajamas, and headed for the front door. The storm had buried the driveway in snow, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out. But as I reached for the doorknob, I heard it again. The tapping. This time, it was coming from the living room window. I turned slowly, my flashlight beam trembling as I aimed it at the window. The frost-covered glass obscured the view, but I could just make out a shape on the other side. It was the same figure from my room, its shadowy form pressed against the glass. A single hand, long, spindly, and impossibly black, tapped against the pane. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. The front door was my only way out, but I'd have to pass the window to get to it. The figure didn't move, its hand continuing to tap in a slow, deliberate rhythm. I took a deep breath, bracing myself, and lunged for the door. As I yanked it open, a blast of icy wind nearly knocked me off my feet. The storm was raging, snow whipping through the air and stinging my face. I stepped out onto the porch, my boots crunching in the snow, and slammed the door behind me. I didn't look back. I ran through the knee-deep snow to my neighbor's house, the wind howling around me. By the time I reached their porch, I was shivering so hard I could barely knock. Mrs. Anderson, a kind woman in her 70s, opened the door and gasped when she saw me. "What happened?" she asked, pulling me inside. I tried to explain, but the words came out jumbled and panicked. She sat me down by the fire, wrapping a blanket around my shoulders, and called my parents. When they arrived the next morning, I refused to go back to the house. When my dad went inside to check, he found the upstairs window in my room wide open, snow covering the floor. But there were no footprints, no signs that anyone or anything had been there. To this day, I don't know what I saw that night. My parents brushed it off as a bad dream or an overactive imagination, but I know the truth. Something was in that house with me, and it's still there. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The wind howled outside, a relentless scream that rattled the windows in their frames. It was a bitterly cold winter night, and the snow was coming down in thick, suffocating waves, blanketing everything in white. I was home alone. My parents had left early that afternoon to attend a wedding 2 towns over, promising they'd return late the next day. Being home alone wasn't new to me. I'd done it plenty of times before. But something about this night felt different. The storm outside was fierce, and the house, an old 2-story Victorian my family had moved into a few years prior, seemed especially restless. Every creak of the wood, every groan of the pipes felt amplified, like the house itself was alive. I had settled in the living room with a blanket, my laptop, and a cup of hot chocolate. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, its glow casting flickering shadows across the walls. I was trying to focus on a movie, but my attention kept wandering to the windows. The curtains were drawn, but I could hear the wind battering against the glass, and every so often the sound of snow shifting or a tree branch scraping against the house made me jump. It was around 9 p.m. when I first heard it. A knock, faint but distinct. It was coming from the front door. I paused the movie, heart pounding. No one would be out in weather like this, not unless it was an emergency. I grabbed my phone and glanced at the screen. No missed calls, no texts. The storm must have knocked out the Wi-Fi, and I realized with a sinking feeling that my cell signal was gone too. The knock came again, louder this time. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. My gut twisted. I grabbed a flashlight from the coffee table and crept to the door. Peering through the peephole, I saw nothing but the swirling snow illuminated by the porch light. The steps were completely covered, untouched. No footprints. I stood there, frozen, my breath shallow. Maybe it was the wind, I told myself. Maybe a branch had hit the door. I was about to turn away when the knock came again. This time it was sharp and insistent. I flung the door open, anger briefly overriding my fear. The icy wind hit me like a slap, but the porch was empty. No footprints, no sign of anyone having been there. Shivering, I slammed the door shut and locked it, my fingers fumbling with the deadbolt. I returned to the living room, trying to shake off the unease. I told myself it was just my imagination, that being alone during a storm was messing with my head. But then I heard it, a faint creak from upstairs. I froze, my pulse quickening. I hadn't been upstairs since my parents left. Slowly, I turned off the TV, plunging the room into silence except for the sound of the wind outside. The creak came again, followed by another. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps. I grabbed the fireplace poker and made my way to the staircase, each step feeling heavier than the last. I hesitated at the bottom, staring up into the darkened hallway. The air felt colder, heavier. My hands tightened around the poker as I forced myself up the stairs. The hallway stretched out before me, dimly lit by the weak glow of the storm through the windows. All the doors were closed except for one, my bedroom. The door was open just a crack, and I could see the faint outline of my bed. I took a step forward, then stopped. The sound of breathing, soft, deliberate, drifted from the room. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The breathing stopped. I stood there, paralyzed, until a loud thump from the room broke the silence. I bolted back downstairs, my heart racing, and locked myself in the living room. I shoved the coffee table against the door and sat there, clutching the poker, my eyes darting to every shadow. Minutes passed, maybe hours. The fire had died down to embers, and the cold seeped into the room. The house was eerily quiet now, save for the wind outside. I began to think maybe I'd imagined it all when the lights suddenly flickered and went out. Darkness engulfed the room, and my breath caught in my throat. The only light came from the faint glow of the embers in the fireplace. I scrambled to find the flashlight, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the switch. When I finally turned it on, the beam of light swept across the room and landed on the figure standing in the corner. It was tall, its silhouette distorted, as if it didn't quite belong in this world. Its head tilted slightly as if it were studying me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The flashlight flickered, the beam growing dimmer with each passing second. The figure took a step toward me. I screamed, dropping the flashlight as I stumbled back. The room plunged into darkness, and I scrambled for the poker, swinging it wildly in front of me. I felt a rush of cold air as if something had brushed past me. And then, silence. I don't know how long I sat there, trembling, waiting for the thing to return. When the sun finally rose, the first weak rays of light streaming through the windows, I found the courage to move. The figure was gone. The house was silent, and everything seemed normal, except for the frost-covered window in the living room. Scrawled in the frost were 3 words, "Never come back." Story the end.
Story number 6.
The winter night was suffocatingly quiet, save for the wind that moaned outside, rattling the old windows in their frames. My parents had gone out of town to attend a family emergency, leaving me alone in our house for the night. I wasn't thrilled about it, but I was 17, old enough to handle myself, or so I thought. The house we lived in was old. It wasn't the creaky, haunted Victorian kind of old, but it had its quirks, uneven floors, unpredictable heating, and sounds that you could never quite place. Normally, I didn't pay attention to these things, but tonight, with snow piling up against the windows and the power flickering occasionally, every noise felt sharper, louder. I had set myself up in the living room. The fire crackled in the hearth, and I was curled up on the couch with a blanket, scrolling through my phone. The TV was on, though I wasn't paying much attention to it. Outside, the snowstorm raged on, the wind howling like some tortured beast. It was the kind of night that made you thankful for warmth and light. Around 9 p.m., the first knock came. It was soft, almost hesitant. I froze, my eyes darting toward the front door. The sound was unmistakable. 3 deliberate knocks. I waited, my heart thudding in my chest. The storm outside was so intense that it didn't make sense for someone to be at the door. Cautiously, I got up and approached the door, my bare feet silent on the wooden floor. I peeked through the peephole, expecting to see a neighbor or maybe someone stranded in the storm. But there was no one. The porch was empty, the fresh snow untouched. The wind was the only movement, swirling flakes in chaotic patterns. "Hello?" I called out, my voice wavering. No response. I double-checked the lock and went back to the couch, telling myself it must have been the wind. But as I sat there, trying to focus on the TV, a gnawing unease crept in. The knock had been too deliberate, too measured to be random. About an hour later, I heard it again. This time, it came from the back door. 3 knocks, louder than before. My stomach turned to ice. The back door was in the kitchen, which faced the snow-covered backyard. Nobody would have reason to go there, especially not in a storm like this. I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a heavy fireplace poker, and crept toward the kitchen. The lights flickered as I entered, casting erratic shadows across the walls. The back door had a small window, and I could see the snow piling up outside. The knocks had stopped, but the memory of them lingered, vibrating in my chest. I didn't dare open the door. Instead, I stood there listening. The wind screamed, and somewhere deep in the house, a floorboard creaked. I whipped around, my pulse spiking. The sound came from upstairs. "Mom? Dad?" I called out, even though I knew they weren't home. Silence answered me. I gripped the poker tighter and moved to the base of the staircase. The house was dark upstairs, the only light coming from the dim glow of the fire downstairs. I debated going up there, every instinct screaming at me to stay put. But then I heard it, a soft, dragging sound like something being pulled across the floor. I forced myself up the stairs, one slow step at a time. The air grew colder as I climbed, each breath coming out in visible puffs. At the top of the stairs, I paused, scanning the darkened hallway. All the doors were closed, except for the one at the end, my bedroom door, which was slightly ajar. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. No answer. I stepped closer, the floor creaking beneath me. The dragging sound stopped. The silence was so thick it felt like the house was holding its breath. I nudged the door open with the poker, my heart hammering in my chest. The room was empty. Nothing was out of place. My bed, my desk, my dresser, everything was exactly as I had left it. But the window was open, letting in a gust of freezing air. Snowflakes swirled inside, melting into the carpet. I ran to the window and slammed it shut, my hands numb from the cold. My mind raced. Had I left it open earlier? I didn't think so. As I turned back toward the door, I noticed something I hadn't before. On the mirror above my dresser, words had been written in the condensation. "Get out." I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The letters were smeared, as if written hastily with a finger. Panic surged through me, and I bolted downstairs, nearly tripping over my own feet. I grabbed my phone, but the signal was gone, and the Wi-Fi was still out. The fire in the hearth had nearly died out, the room growing colder by the second. I grabbed another log and tossed it onto the embers, watching as the flames sputtered back to life. My eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of movement. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it, a shadow, darker than the rest, moving across the wall. I turned sharply, but there was nothing there. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in. My heart raced as the shadow appeared again, this time closer to the stairs. I clutched the poker and backed toward the front door, my hand fumbling with the lock. The shadow moved again, darting out of sight just as I swung the door open and bolted outside. The icy wind hit me like a slap, but I didn't care. I ran barefoot through the snow, slipping and sliding, until I reached the neighbor's house. I pounded on their door until the lights came on. Mrs. Carver, an older woman who lived alone, opened the door, her face lined with concern. I stumbled inside, barely able to speak as I tried to explain what had happened. She gave me a blanket and sat me by her fireplace, listening as I recounted every detail. "You're not the first," she said quietly once I finished. "That house, it's been empty for years before your family moved in. The last owners left in the middle of the night, said they saw things, heard things." I stared at her, my skin prickling. "Why didn't anyone tell us?" She shook her head. "People don't like to talk about it, but if I were you, I wouldn't go back there tonight." I didn't. I stayed at her house until my parents returned the next morning. When I told them what had happened, they brushed it off as an overactive imagination. But I knew what I'd seen, what I'd heard. The house never felt the same after that night, and I never stayed home alone again. We moved a year later. To this day, I still get chills when I think about that winter night and the words written on the mirror. Story the end.